This video is for EOC review, EOC review Unit 3, and this is ecology. Alright, so we talked about a lot of terms in ecology, and just to make sure you're familiar with like the levels of organization in ecology. The primary one is the biosphere, not primary, the largest one is the biosphere, and this is like the entire globe. And then the globe is divided up into biomes, and these are areas that have similar climates, similar communities, and a community is just a group of animals or a group of all the living things in an area. Then next you have ecosystems. And an ecosystem can be as complex as a lake or as simple as a backyard. And this is all the abiotic and biotic factors in an area. Abiotic are living things, like rocks, of course, everyone's favorite, and then, but also things like climate and wind and precipitation and the amount of nutrients and that kind of thing that are in the environment. And then, of course, the biotic factors like plants, animals, bacteria, that sort of thing. And then there is the community, and communities are just all the living things in an area. And communities are made up of individual populations, and a population is just all of one particular kind of organism, like population of oak trees, a population of moose, a population of black crappie, or whatever. And then, of course, you have individuals that make up any ecosystem. We talked a little bit about aquatic ecosystems and some different terms. I want to move on, though, to nutrient cycles. And we talked about the water cycle, and this is just how water cycles through an ecosystem. You should know that. The carbon cycle, and this is just how carbon cycles through. And how does carbon cycle through? Well, carbon is found in the atmosphere. So you have CO2 in the atmosphere, and this enters the community through plants. And plants make that into sugar. Organisms consume that, like us and others, and we consume that carbon dioxide. We breathe some of it back out into the atmosphere, and then, of course, we put some of it back into the ground when we die, when we have through waste. We also put some of it into the air through things like burning of fossil fuels and that sort of thing. There's my factory, or pollutants like really old car exhaust and that kind of thing. All right, and so this puts carbon back into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle is a little more complex. Actually, it's a lot more complex. Nitrogen, most abundant gas found in the atmosphere. Nitrogen diffuses into the ground from the atmosphere, or is rained into the ground, and that nitrogen is then fixed by these tiny bacteria. Of course, I've blown them up for effect here. Tiny bacteria, and they actually fix the nitrogen by fixing it, making it from unusable to something that is usable. And by fixing it, then things like plants who have deep roots in the ground can make use of that nitrogen now. And then we eat plants, and we eat organisms that eat plants, and so that's how we get nitrogen. And then when organisms die, they put that nitrogen back into the soil, and thus the cycle begins. And then there's also the phosphorus cycle, and this is primarily things like rocks is where most phosphorus is found initially, and it rains down on those rocks, and that is called weathering, and phosphorus gets in the oceans and in the water. Fish and plants gather up that phosphorus. We eat those things, we get phosphorus that way. And so phosphorus makes its way into the ecosystem and then goes back into the ground, and thus that cycle continues as well. Well, when we're talking about community relationships in ecology, there are several ones that we need to highlight. We talk a lot about something called symbiosis. And this is when two organisms have a long-term relationship with one another. They don't necessarily depend on one another in the sense that they're helping one another, because that's not the case sometimes. But at least one depends on the other. So here's a couple of them. We use symbols like pluses and minuses and zeros to help us understand these. Commensalism is what we call a plus zero relationship, because one organism is getting a benefit, the plus, and the zero is getting nothing. Cattle egrets sit on top of cows and eat insects. The cow isn't really bothered by the insects, so the cow's not receiving any real benefit, but of course the cattle egret is receiving a ton of benefit there. Mutualism is a plus relationship in which both organisms are receiving benefit. Perfect example of this is the clownfish and the sea anemone. The fish gets protection, gets food, the anemone gets cleaned daily, and also gets to eat clownfish waste and whatever else the clownfish drags in. The anemone gets to eat. Parasitism is a plus-minus relationship in that parasitism, one organism is benefiting, the other organism is losing resources because the parasite is taking resources away. Now, a parasite doesn't want to kill its host, because by killing its host, it would, of course, limit its own life. Now, some parasites eventually kill their host. I use the example of the tomato hornworm and braconid wasps that lay their eggs inside these worms, and eventually the eggs hatch, and the little baby wasps feast on their old home and then fly away to go find other things. A couple other relationships. One is called competition. Now, competition is a minus relationship. Why is that? Because both organisms that compete with one another are losing resources. A cheetah kills a gazelle and is chomping away at the gazelle, and a lion comes up and says, "No, my gazelle." Well, the lion has to run the cheetah off, and the cheetah has wasted resources, and the lion has wasted resources to fight the cheetah off. But there's a competition there. Both organisms are losing resources in order to gain something. There's different kinds of competition. There's intra-specific and inter-specific competition. Intra-specific is competition within a species, like two rams competing over the mating rights of the female, or two bears fighting for mating rights, or two wolves fighting over a carcass, or whatever. Inter-specific is where two different species are fighting over territory, or whatever, resources. Then there is predation. And predation is a plus-minus relationship in that one organism actually feeds upon another. One is the predator. The predator is the killer, and the other is the prey. This is oftentimes the little gazelle that is getting eaten by the lion. Now, with predation, we have something called boom-bust cycles. All right, and so whereas the lion will be red, and we'll make the gazelle a nice purple. All right, the gazelle population might be going up. Well, what's going to happen to the lion population? It's going to go up as well. Well, as the lion population goes up, what do you expect to happen to the gazelle population? It's going to tank. Well, gazelle population tanks, so does the lion population. And these two organisms will remain in this cycle, and it's actually a very good thing for both of them. they are controlling one another's population, and neither one of them is getting out of control. So neither one of them is able to completely exhaust all the resources available to them. And so this is a normal relationship between predator and prey. And we call this study of populations population dynamics. And there are different factors that go into population dynamics. Two main ones that we've talked about. There are density dependent factors and density independent factors. Now, a density dependent factor is typically a biotic factor. These are factors that depend on the size of the population. You think, for instance, you have 1,000 wildebeests getting ready to cross a river that has 20 hungry crocodiles in it. That population will be 20 less after the crossing. But the population of wildebeests really isn't affected too much by that because there's 1,000 of them, of course, but it's a density dependent kind of factor. All right. Whereas a density independent factor, these are typically abiotic factors. These are factors that have an equal effect regardless of the size of the population. Take that same 1,000 wildebeests and put them next to a volcano. Well, it doesn't matter how fast they can run or how strong they are, how unafraid of volcanoes they are. The volcano dispatches each one of them equally. And so it doesn't matter the size of the population. A forest fire destroys everything in the forest, whether there's 10 birds or 10,000 of them. It doesn't matter. We talked about things called growth rates, and growth rates are just how fast populations grow, and these things are directly effective based on birth rates, death rates, immigration, which is people coming in or organisms coming in, emigration, organisms leaving. And we talked about two population growth models. One of them was the exponential growth model, or the J-curve exponential. And this is where there are no factors that are stopping the population from growing. And the population can just basically double in every generation. Human populations are a good example of this. We have eliminated, our limiting factors, and therefore we are doubling all the time, and there's nothing that's stopping our populations from growing. Well, most populations have something called a carrying capacity, which is also, or usually denoted with a K. And as an organism reaches that carrying capacity, they will kind of level off near it. And we'll do something that looks like this. All right, and this is called logistic growth, or an S-curve growth. All right, and that carrying capacity is usually determined by some sort of limiting factor. Well, maybe there's only so much food. Well, what happens if food gets really scarce? Carrying capacity goes down, population goes down. Food is all of a sudden in abundance. Carrying capacity goes up, population goes up. And so carrying capacity is directly affected upon about the limiting factors that are available in that particular ecosystem. We talked about biodiversity as well, and biodiversity is just variation of life on the planet. One thing I want to get to with ecology before we close up here is this concept of energy flow. Now, this requires us to have two kinds of knowledge: food chains and food webs. Now, a food chain is just a single line, whereas the bird, I'll attempt to draw a bird. The bird eats the worm. Well, the snake eats the bird. The snake with the green tongue eats the bird. And maybe the hawk that's big and nasty eats the snake. And so this is just a typical food chain relationship, whereas one thing eats another, and it's just a single line of organisms. Where a food web represents an entire ecosystem worth of interactions. So rather than draw one, I just went out and found one, a nice one. And so you can see all these interactions that are going on in this particular ecosystem that just happens to have lions and goats and wildcats in it. Strange, strange place, but whatever. You get the idea. Now, energy is flowing through this ecosystem. What do I mean by that? Well, out here's the sun, and the sun is the source of all energy. And what is able to get that energy? Plants. Well, things like mice and rabbits and goats apparently eat trees or eat plants that are able to take in that energy, but they're not able to get nearly as much energy as the plant got from the sun. And of course, the plant's not able to get nearly as much energy as the sun has available to us. But then when the goat gets eaten by the jackal or the wildcat, or the mouse gets eaten by the owl, there's even less energy available. And then when the lion eats the wildcat or the goat or the jackal, um, strange food web here, there's even less energy available. And so we represent this with something called an energy pyramid. And so whereas at the bottom you have the producers, and these are the organisms that are producing the food. They're doing photosynthesis. They're getting energy directly from the sun. These are your plants. And let's just say that for the sake of fun, we have 1,000 joules of energy available here. Well, the primary consumers are the next in line. These are the goats and the mice. Only 10% of that energy is going to be available at the next level. This is called the rule of 10%. That other 90% is lost as waste or heat and is used for homeostasis. Well, the secondary consumer is like the, the wildcat. There's only 10 joules of energy left. And then, of course, at the top, tertiary consumer, the lion in this case, there's only 1 joule left. Now, if there's only 1 joule left out of that original 1,000 for the lion, then what would you expect? More trees or more lions? More mice or more lions? And so what ends up happening is that we have 2 other pyramids that we can also show this information with. And one is the pyramid of numbers, and the other one is the pyramid of biomass. Now, biomass is just simply the dry mass of an organism, and it's, or you could say the amount of an organism, which is just fine. And so we would say that there's probably more trees, more producers, and there's much more amount of producers than anything else because they have the direct line of energy. Same thing with the primary consumers. There's more of them because they have the next direct line, and up the ladder all the way to tertiary or even quaternary consumers. Much fewer of them. One lion can cover several square miles as far as energy and as far as territory is concerned because he needs all of that in order to keep himself alive, because there's much less energy available at the top than there is at the bottom. Now, one last concept as we near the 20-minute mark. We have ecological succession. 2 types of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. With primary succession, this is where an ecosystem begins at rocks. Hawaii, how many ever 1,000 years ago, when it was not inhabited and was just a brand new volcano that was cooling and some brand new rocks. Well, it didn't stay rocks for long because these first organisms move in that are able to live on rocks because they don't need roots and they have very little nutrient need. And these are called pioneer species. Pioneers, of course, being the first ones in the area. These are things like mosses and lichens. Now, what happens over time? Those rocks are going to break down, and then you're going to have soil. All right, and then what do you expect happens with the soil? You're going to have things like grasses, and eventually you're going to have things as the soil gets deeper. You're going to have like little shrubs, little trees, pine trees, things that have very shallow root systems. And then eventually, as we keep shoving secondary off the page, you're going to have hardwood trees as that soil gets really deep. This is called a climax community. It's the absolute highest that the ecosystem can achieve. It is at the climax. All right. And ecosystems are in a constant state of this succession. You can look at an ecosystem, say like LBL, and LBL is a climax community, but there are parts of LBL that are back here at rocks and are still doing this primary succession, starting at rocks, going to soil, grass, shrubs, pine trees, and so forth. But certain sections of LBL are your hardwoods, and they're not changing, and they've been there for years, and they'll be there for years. Well, then what is secondary succession? Secondary succession is the exact same thing, except it is starting at soil, not starting at rocks. LBL, full of trees, everything is nice and cozy in LBL. And then one day, all trees begin to burn down because of a careless camper and his need to roast marshmallows. Well, all the trees get wiped off. Well, does that mean that LBL starts over at rock? No. There is fresh soil there for grass to grow, then shrubs, then the pine trees, then the hardwood trees. And so this is where a ecosystem starts over at the soil level.